And welcome back to the Financially Simple Experience. So here's a question for you. What do you do when you hired the wrong person? You know, we spend a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of sweat equity, intellectual equity. We use a lot of our time and energy trying to hire the right people. You articulate and you write out the perfect job description. You go through countless hours of interviews and you find what you believe to be the right candidate for this particular job. I got to tell you, one of the most difficult aspects of business ownership is people. And at that point, if you're riding down the road, you probably yelled out an amen if you're a business owner. Friends, I've sat down with business owners, hundreds of business owners. I speak to thousands of business owners per year. I've heard business owners say things like, I'm done, I can't handle HR. I've heard others say in jest, I'd have a good life if I didn't have customers or employees. People. It doesn't matter what your product, what your service is. It doesn't matter what your aspirations in life are. If you're going to be in business, you're going to deal with people. Now, if you move from that of a lifestyle business to where you have a value creation style business, a lifestyle meaning that is mainly you and it's you basically driving the bus and you can kind of live your lifestyle in and through the business, you might not have that many employees. But if you're going to value creation, the type of business that I talk about and have spoken about now for years, the ones I've written books on, if you're trying to build a business that somebody else is willing to pay you money for, then you're going to have people to help you. And with each person comes a different set of skills, a different set of needs, different personalities. As a business owner, it's our job to put people in the right places. I can remember learning chess as a child. And my mom and dad wanted my brother and my sister and I to know how to play chess. There was some study they read, I'm sure, that said that if we learned how to play chess, we'd be great strategicians. And so I can remember reading about the King's Gambit, the Queen's Gambit decline, and all these various types of moves. And ultimately, when I sat at the chessboard, my job was to put the right pieces in the right squares on the chessboard. Well, very similar, we as business owner, our job is to hire the right people and put them in the right seats. So whenever we go through these gyrations, this laborious process of trying to find the right person, inevitably, at some point, we're going to realize that we've hired the wrong person for the role or perhaps the overall fit in the company. What do we do about it? We're going to talk through that on today's episode. Before we dive into that particular question, though, we have to make some assumptions. The first assumption is that the expectations were clearly established. In other words, you had a clear job description, you had clear KPIs, you had clear managerial duties and oversight in place before this hire ever came into your company. The next thing is we're going to assume that you've done personality profiling to make sure the person is the right profile for the position that you've hired them for. We're also going to make the assumption that your managerial capabilities are in place and they're exact, that you've provided the tools for success, that you have the right amount of money or resources, software, training in place, and so much more. We're going to give grace. We're going to make sure before we ever reach the decision of what do we do with this person who's perhaps not the right fit, we have to first make sure that we as leaders, we as business owners have done everything we can do to position this particular person for success. One of my favorite verses in Scripture in the Bible is Ephesians 6:10. The Bible says, "And having done all to stand, stand." In other words, at the end of the day, we have to do our very best. And as leaders, we have to make sure that we've done our very best for our employees, for those who we hired into our company to excel, to succeed. Many times I hear business owners fussing about an employee that they're not the right cultural fit or they're a bad employee. When the reality is that the owner or the manager hasn't provided the resources or the tools or the metrics or the levers for success. And whose fault is that? It's certainly not the employees. John Maxwell says, and I love this quote, everything rises and falls with leadership. So let's make the assumption for today's conversation that you as a business owner has done everything within your power to provide success, a pathway to success for this employee. And here we are. We realize now this employee is just not the right person for the job. So let's dissect that. One thing that we have to agree on is that cultural fit is non-negotiable. It's non-negotiable. One of the biggest drivers of a company's success is its corporate culture. The culture. In fact, 72% of companies that participated in the PwC's 2021 Global Cultural Survey reported, and I quote, "Culture helps successful change initiatives happen." Culture. You see, a positive corporate culture enhances productivity. It enhances productivity through interdepartmental collaboration. It promotes employee engagement. On the other hand, a poor cultural fit can demoralize the team. It decreases productivity. It drives the team into a lull, almost like a drag. I mentioned in the last episode, my family and I were on the coast this last month or so fishing offshore Florida. We were 20 miles offshore and we were noticing a boat trying to cut through the waves, and it just couldn't move at the same speed at which we were moving. And I was talking to the captain. He said, "Oh yeah, that's so-and-so." And he named the boat and named the captain. He's a friend of a friend. And he said, "Yeah, that boat is covered with barnacles." Now, I've talked about barnacles in the past on my podcast. I even wrote about it in the book. But a barnacle is a crustacean that kind of sticks to everything. Think about this. If you had a boat that's really slick on the bottom, it's supposed to be waxed, and the water can just slide over it very gracefully. Now you have these barnacles on the bottom, and it's just not allowing the water to move. It creates a drag. That's what happens whenever you have somebody with a poor cultural fit in your company. If they're on the wrong team, they become disgruntled. They create problems. They create toxicity amongst the team. It causes burnout. It's poor cultural fit. So whenever we're dealing with poor employees, we first have to make the assumption that we've done everything within the power as the leader to promote success, that we've got a track record in place. We've got the mechanisms, the capabilities, the software, the training, the resources in place for success. That's number one. Number two is the cultural fit is non-negotiable. The culture that you aspire your company to have, it is non-negotiable. Like, do not pass go. Here's a line in the sand. Get on board or get off. We have to take that position, friends. You say, well, why? As I mentioned earlier, if you don't, your company has a certain flavor. It has a certain culture. It has a certain acumen that allows your team, your core, your nucleus of people to stay. And when toxicity erupts, just like that barnacle, it's going to create drag on the company. So if we agree on the fact that we've done everything we can for success for this employee, and that we agree that our culture of our company is non-negotiable, our company's culture is paramount. Now we have to look at, well, what are the signs of a poor cultural fit? And they can be subtle. Sometimes they can take a passive, or they may take a proactive approach whenever they reveal themselves. And likewise, you could take a very passive approach to identifying them, or you could take a very proactive approach for identifying cultural abnormalities. So when we're looking at an employee who's not the right employee for our company, here's some of the signs that you often may see. Frequent absence or tardiness. Have you ever seen that, where an employee is trying to figure out how to leave early or show up late or take as much vacation time as possible or stay out longer on the lunch break than they should? There's a cultural fit issue there. Maybe there's inconsistent productivity, or there's no initiative. They're just not motivated. You're having to manage them. I mean, think about it. Do you really want to manage people? I can't think of a business owner out there that wants to manage people. In fact, we want to hire people within our companies that are self-managing, that are there to show up and get it done. You don't have to deal with the nonsense of managing people. So when you see inconsistent productivity or a lack of initiative, it could be a sign of a poor cultural fit. How about this one? Poor relationships within the workforce, maybe with a coworker or with management. I call it toxicity. Whenever you see an employee, management, shareholders, which are backbiting, dragging down, talking negative, almost like we're in 5th grade, almost like we're in high school. Can you believe what C&C said? I mean, it's garbage. When you start seeing that, you've got a cultural problem. There could be lack of participation in company events. You set up a company event and they just don't show up. They don't care. I wasn't required to be there. Or how about this one? I'm going to take my ball and go home unless you do so-and-so. I call it fight or flight. Unless I get my way, and here's a threat, fight or flight. Those are passive approaches that you can see. As you watch for these signs, you can start identifying and you can address the problems of the cultural fit before they create major problems. But if you allow it to fester, then your company could dive. Your productivity could dive. Your profitability could dive. Now, we talked about a passive approach. Sometimes, though, if you leave someone in a position too long, you may have to take a proactive approach. You may have to evaluate if the employee is in the wrong seat or if the employee is just the wrong fit for the company. So here's a couple points you may consider. You could and you should drive safety in reporting. There's a thing called the iceberg of ignorance. I remember this years ago. I wrote about it in my book. And I think about the iceberg because we all, heard the tragic story of the Titanic. And you have this little piece of ice, relatively speaking, sticking out of the water, and this colossal, giant piece of ice under the water, hidden beneath the surface. In a business, frontline workers, frontline managers know the garbage that's happening. They can see under the water. We business owners oftentimes, we senior executives oftentimes only see a little fraction, and we see it through a clouded lens many times. There has to be an availability or a safety in reporting where frontline workers can address toxicity without the fear of reprisal, without the fear of retaliation. I was dealing with a situation this last year with a business that there was an address issued by a frontline worker to senior management, and then senior management opened up and told the entire company what he and she said and did. It kind of violated, let me just say, it did violate several laws, and there could have been a lawsuit which arose out of that. There probably should have been a lawsuit on that one. But there wasn't a safety and reporting mechanism. So as business owners, we can take a positive approach, a proactive approach, and try to set a safety and reporting mechanism through a organizational chart, through organizational structure. Another thing you can do is you can value growth over ego. Value growth over ego. How many times have you heard this potential person say, I? Or the me monster, as one famous comedian says, the me monster. As a business owner, as the executive, you should want the people who say we on the team. We, company culture. And if you can instill these 2 points in your team's mind, then you can catch poor cultural fits before they fester, before they turn into a toxic environment. So we talk about this poor cultural fit, but what do we do when we hire an employee and they're just not the high performer? You went through the process, you saw the resume, they talked the good game, they did X, Y, Z, they get through the screening process, they get into the job, and boom, they're not producing at the rate to which we hired them to produce. You know, it should be a rarity if you get your HR processes up and running properly. It should be a rarity. First of all, we've got to be willing to have tough conversations. I can remember my soccer coach. Love this guy dearly. His name was James Frey. One day I hope he listens to this podcast. He would run the dog out of us as we were playing soccer. I can remember one day I had a bug. I was ticked off about something, and he told me to do something. I turned around and I kicked that ball, the soccer ball, at him as hard as I could, which I had a pretty good leg back in the day, and it just barely missed at him. And he turned around with fire in his eyes, and instantly he sent me and he said, "Come here to me right now." Oh, crap. I knew I was in trouble. Yes, sir. And he had a tough conversation with me. And I'll never forget the conversation. He said, "Son, you've got skill. You've got charisma. You've got talent. But you will not play on this team if you do not shift this attitude." And then he said this quote, and I can almost quote it word for word. He said, "My job is to lead you to success. If you succeed, I succeed." I'll never forget the quote. My job is to lead you to success. If you succeed, I succeed. Whenever we're dealing with somebody that isn't a high performer, we have to be willing to have the tough conversations. Maybe you can use that language. My job as an employer is to allow you to succeed. If you succeed, I succeed. If you fail, I fail. As one of my colleagues say, lead with empathy, being transparent. However, we also have to be willing to make the hard decision and let people go. In order to build a great team, sometimes you have to swap things around. I'm reminded every year whenever the draft comes up in professional football, or they'll shift players around from one team to the next, trying to build the team which gels perfectly. It's okay. It's okay to let somebody go. It's okay. And it sucks. That's probably the hardest thing we deal with as business owners. I said in the last episode, dealing with people is hard. It is. Letting somebody go, there's no words to explain that. So we talk about what if the employee is not a high performer? But let's give grace. You know, I've been given a lot of grace in my life. What happens if it's the right employee? They're the right employee. They're just in the wrong seat. Jim Collins introduces this, and I kind of alluded to it in the early phase of this podcast. In his book, Good to Great, he uses a concept called get on the bus. The idea being that you only let the right people on the bus, and then you make sure they're in the right seats. In other words, you make sure the employees fit with the culture of the company and that they end up being in the correct roles of the company. So just suppose you've hired the right person, but you find them in the wrong role. How can you identify that? How can you tell? Here's a few signs. Maybe they've expressed the fact that they're feeling underutilized. I know in my own life, I've said things like, I want to be allowed to work to my fullest potential. I don't like being held back. Maybe they feel like they're being underutilized. Maybe they're just trying to make the best of the situation. They make things like, yeah, this too shall pass. You got the right person. They're just in the wrong role. Perhaps, just perhaps, you see them looking externally. Not in the sense that they're going to go find another job, but hey, I'm going to start a side business. I'm going to do some coursework. I'm going to do some education. Nothing wrong with all those. And all those are admirable. But it is a sign that you could have the right person in the wrong role. They fit with your company culture. Whatever your company culture is, this employee has it. They embody the company culture. But they're just not happy. Maybe they exhibit the company's core values. You know, integrity is a big one. Honesty is a big one. Self-starting is a big one. Those are all things I hear when I talk with business owners. Maybe this employee is all of those things. They're just bored or frustrated. If you see this in an employee, then perhaps, just perhaps, you have the right employee in the wrong seat. Now, you're left with a couple of decisions here. Number one, can you afford to move the employee to another seat? Many times you can't, and it's okay. You can have a very candid conversation. Look, you're the right person for our company. We just don't have a place for you today. Or maybe you can, if they're a stellar performer, maybe you can graduate somebody else out of the company or to another position and slide them into the position which best fits them. What do you do, though? What do you do at the end of the day when you have an employee who is the right employee for the company, they're just in the wrong position? You have a one-on-one conversation with the employee, and the discussions should be centered around what their needs are, what actions you're going to take to help them maximize their strengths. You as a leader, that is your job. Help them succeed. Remember, if they succeed, you succeed. So if you find somebody that's the right employee in the company, they're in the wrong fit, then you find out what it's going to take to help them maximize their strengths. I read a book a couple of years back, and I think I've referenced it on the show a couple of times, and that is The Dream Manager. And it's not talking about a person who's a manager. It's talking about managing the dreams of your employees. You can have this very tough conversation. I can remember in my own business, I've had employees that come in and I said, look, I realize you're in the wrong seat. I realize that. I realize that you're unhappy and that you can see other aspirations. Let's build a path to move you from where you're at today to where you aspire to be. And then the leader and the employee work together and they come to an agreement. All of a sudden, morale changes. All of a sudden, you can see it all come together. But how do you proceed whenever you have an employee who's just the wrong fit? They're not right for the role, and they're not right for the organization. They're just the wrong fit. It's not an easy one. If you're in an at-will state, currently pretty much everybody is except for Montana. Now, every state's a little different with law, so this is where you need outside counsel and lawyers to help. You can terminate the employee. Now, contracts, again, forbidden. I'm not trying to give legal advice here. This is why I'm telling you to talk to your lawyer. But you can terminate the employee. You still need to create documentation outlining what led you to the incident of terminating the employee. It's not there to be slanderous or create libel, which is where you're writing negative comments down about a person. It's so that if you're taken to court for any reason, you can show what happened. You can show the timeline. You're documenting your decision. Firing an employee because they're a poor fit isn't quite the same as terminating somebody for misconduct. So this is where you want to get some legal help. Talk with your counsel on this. Ultimately, you're going to schedule a meeting and you're going to have an official termination letter prepared. Your HR, your legal counsel has already helped you as a business owner prepare and navigate the waters to try to mitigate any type of legal action. If you go in a way of taking a proactive approach, it can help you mitigate legal action, lawsuits. And as I said before, firing somebody isn't easy. It's one of the lowest points of a business owner and an employee's life. I've had to do it a few times in my career. Nights, weeks beforehand. Loss of sleep, stress. You know it's the right thing, but there's an internal battle that you face as the business owner. You feel like you're violating your own cultural standards. You're violating your own ethos. After all, if they succeed, you succeed. You realize that you have failed, not them. It's like the old dang saying, not you, it's me. Firing somebody's tough. Unfortunately, friends, as a business owner, sometimes we have to do the hard thing. A few years back, I did an episode on my Facebook Live channel where I was in my orchard. We have apples and pears and peaches and other trees around the farm. I took a lopping shear to this beautiful apple tree. It was gorgeous. Beautiful apple tree. It was about 4 inches in diameter. It stood probably 18 foot tall. And I took these shears and I began butchering this tree, cut it down to where it literally was a stick, the main stalk sticking up, the main trunk of the tree sticking up, with maybe about 10 branches. And they were stubby. They were only about 8 to 10 inches long. So this massive, beautiful tree, almost 20 foot in height, was cut down to about 8 foot. It was so ugly that whenever I posted it, I had some friends who were in the landscape business and the horticulture business and the arborists were tree trimming business. And they said, dude, stick to what you know how to do. Now, what they didn't realize is I have a horticulture degree, and I knew that if I did this to this tree and properly managed it, that the next year it'd be abundant with fruit. And it was. The key is this, is when you're faced with an employee who is not the right fit, doing the hard thing, cutting that employee loose, though it's ugly and it's going to have repercussions and it's going to lead to hard work, it is necessary. It is necessary. You can't allow toxicity to stay in the company. Can't. Go back to my apple tree. The following year, we had over 20 gallons of apples on this stick tree. And every year since, as I've now been retraining this tree, it has been the most fruitful tree in our whole orchard. In business, whenever we've had to cut employees for lack of cultural fit, for toxicity, for whatever reason, they didn't fit the role was eliminated, whatever, you have to almost agree with me that the company flourishes thereafter. So as we look at this idea of hiring somebody and they're just not the right fit, let's first take a hard assessment of ourselves and make sure that we provided all the tools needed for that employee to succeed. And as we identify that we have to be resolute in our opinion that culture is non-negotiable. It is non-negotiable. Let me say it again. Cultural fit is non-negotiable. If we are centered in those 2 points, then from there forward, all the various lines of that employee, whether they're the right person in the wrong seat, the wrong person altogether, whatever it is, it becomes easier for us to handle. Friends, I realize when we talk through this, it is very tough. The idea, again, of letting somebody go is very tough. My charge to you is make sure that your systems are there for success. If they succeed, you succeed. Nail the culture down. What do you want your company to look like and feel like? Get super specific. And then from there, if you find yourself in a situation where an employee is in the wrong seat, wrong fit, speak with HR, talk with your attorney, seek outside counsel as needed, but make the decision. Make the decision, deal with the consequences, and reap the reward. Life is hard. This is a hard episode. This is a weighty episode. But life is good. Life is good. And it can be frustrating. I've been there. I've been there spending dozens, if not hundreds of hours training somebody, hiring somebody, preparing somebody for success, and it just doesn't work out. It's tough. If you need help, reach out to us. That's what we do day in, day out. Until next time, friends, y'all go out and make it a great day.